is not opening anytime that we are aware of. With respect to the distance separation requirements that we adopted, and I think they were adopted appropriately at the time, it was an unknown use, it was a new use, and we were certainly concerned about potential side unintended consequences and impacts. So as you see what we adopted on the left-hand side compared to what the state requires, we really went overboard with respect to distance separation. And again, this is what council adopted, given potential impacts of these types of uses. And so where we find ourselves is that we have 5 of the 6 top candidates that are moving forward. 3 have cannabis permits, 2 are open, and the other 2 cannot find spots. And so the issue that we have here is this is really a council policy decision. Do we do nothing and just stick to the 3, potentially 4 that exist, and not make any changes to the code? Although I will say here that there is a minor text amendment that we will need to do regardless of what the council wants to do with respect to policy changes. It's just an error with respect to the distance separation we identified for labs and cultivators, and the distance there should be 500, and it's very clearly an error, and we'll bring that forward and talk about that later. But really the issue in front of you this evening or this afternoon is relative to other changes that might allow the other 2 operators, other 2 applicants to find spots. So with respect to amending existing regulations, there's a lot of different things that council could do. Staff has presented a couple of different ideas to the city council, but anything that the city council wanted to do or EdTech wanted to recommend, if that's where they wanted to go, would require some changes to the existing distance separation requirements. It may be appropriate to align ourselves with the state or something similar, but again, lots of different options to how to change those. But any changes would require the distance separations to be modified. With respect to the 2 existing operators, again, they've been operating for, in the case of Essence, a couple of months. Varda closer to 5 or 6 months, and really haven't seen a single code compliance violation come forward. There have been a couple of calls for service, but it was related to not the operation itself. And given how they're actually operating, it's much more akin to a retail shop that is high turnover versus anything else. And so again, limited amendments might be considered that would allow the 2 remaining applicants to move forward, and then the cleanup that would be required. The code states that it's 1,000 feet from lab to retailers and cultivators, but it should be 500 feet. And so that's a technical cleanup that we'll bring forward separate and apart, or as part of a larger policy change. So, with respect to the existing operators, we had identified with respect to potential revenue up to 6 retail dispensaries. We had roughly estimated $2 million or $330,000 annually in tax from those 6 operators. The initial to date, looking at the very limited operations that have happened, we're falling a little bit short of that. And although the previous analysis with respect to the businesses, we didn't look at employment opportunities. I think that you've seen several letters come forward talking about the impacts of potential opportunity employments of these types of dispensaries, but that wasn't part of anything that we had studied before, because what we were looking at previously was really trying to get the best operators that we could in, that were going to be safe, that were not going to have impacts to the neighborhood. And we only placed, the total scoring was really about 15% of that was relative to community benefits. So we weren't really looking at opportunity, employment opportunities or other financial considerations. Which leads me to the other discussion this afternoon is, in addition to any changes that the council may wish to make regarding distance separation, the council may wish to consider a new permitting process related to equity. And this is not new. This is not something that Pasadena has thought of. Obviously, it exists in many places throughout the state. It's slightly different from city to city. I've included in the report just some examples from some larger cities. Some smaller cities also have equity considerations. Uh, it could be very much like Oakland, and you'll see a very common theme between these three with respect to these large cities and their programs. Um, it, it's about a resident of that city. It's about having a certain annual income, right? It generally is at the this is like the moderate rate you would consider, and then you're living in an area that has been impacted by a higher number of arrests related to drug offenses, and or were arrested for a drug offense yourself. And that's pretty similar to San Francisco model, but this is the Long Beach one, has a slightly higher, has the same equity, excuse me, has the same annual income number, 80% of the area median income, but then identifies some other criteria with respect to total net worth. And then you're living in a certain area related to household income that's lower, and then you were arrested of some crime related to cannabis. And the idea here being that in all three of these is that looking to offer a permit to those that have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs, as indicated in the San Francisco model here. San Francisco has some more criteria beyond the first two, and it speaks to ensuring that the person that has the business that gets the permit is actually the owner of the business, or at least 51% owner of the business. And I think that's an important consideration if that's something the council wants us to look at and study further, because we've seen examples where an equity permit is given and then it's basically sold to a corporation for them to run. And I think the intent of most of these programs is really to have the person who the equity permit is granted to run the business or to maintain ownership of that business. And in addition to those, San Francisco continues to require at least 3 of these 6. And it's, again, you're either arrested or you're living in an area that was negatively impacted. And in this case, there's one of the criteria is even you attended school in the San Francisco Unified School District for at least 5 years from 1971 to 2016. That was an interesting criteria. So again, given the council's direction, staff could go study how to tailor, if this is the direction the council wanted to go, how to tailor a program that was more Pasadena specific. Could be based on either equity issues, it could be based on greater contributions for community benefits, a combination thereof. And again, if that's something the council wants to consider, we have currently a process that's going on that's existing where 2 operators have 7 more months to find a spot. And so if there is a new program that council's contemplating, it should be either after both of those applicants find a spot and or the time runs out. So that concludes the presentation. We're here looking for direction. We don't have a recommendation at this point in time, but are happy to take recommendation of the subcommittee and do further research and return.
Thank you, David, for the presentation. Committee members, actually, would you guys like to hear the public comment before we deliberate or talk?
I have a few questions.
Go ahead.
How many comments do we have, by the way?
2 the last time I checked.
We still have 2 public speaker cards.
So I have a few comments. David, you mentioned, I was confused about the statement about no code violations, but there were several calls for service. Can you be more specific about, I mean, those create neighborhood impacts as well, even though there may not be a code violation. What can you share?
Sure. 2 calls for service at Varda related to a homeless person that was shouldn't have been there. That it was actually, the call came from the business operator.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for that. And then as we're issuing these permits, do we not have any change of control language to, I mean, you go through this whole process of getting a quality person in place. What prevents people from getting entitled and flipping this to someone who we're not as thrilled about.
So
And I know that came up with the MedMan issue as well, if I recall right.
This is Teresa Fuentes of the City Attorney's Office, and I'll jump in really quickly to say that, yes, with regards to a change of control prior to issuance of permits, the city has determined that the permits cannot be, the site or the CUP itself cannot be transferred. We haven't faced the question of what happens after permits, and we would deal with that as it came up.
I mean, that seems, if we have concerns about that, I mean, I guess from a legal perspective, can you add rules and conditions then fully entitled to operate and say, hey, if there's a change of control, we're gonna do something different? I mean, is that reasonable?
Change of control is the phrase that was used, again, prior to issuance of all permits. I would frankly have to go back and look at the code with regard to what happens after issuance of permits. So we would have to take a look at that.
in addition to after the research and getting back to you, I would add that there is an annual review currently required for each permit operator, each permit location. So to the extent that there was a change that was allowed and was legal in terms of ownership or operation, we would want to make sure that they were still operating correctly within all of the required rules and regulations. If not, we're not obligated to issue the annual renewal.
Okay. So
Do you mind if I piggyback on that? Because I think it's interesting that we would deny an applicant if they changed before we issued a permit, but after, a month after, we're like, oh, this is cool, or you're okay because you could sell now. I feel like there should be a stipulation that if an applicant is going to sell, they should at least hold it for 2 or 3 years or 4 or 5 years. In some cases, I've seen actually 5 years where applicants, I don't know if it's just based on cannabis businesses, where applicants have to hold their permit, and any changes, they have to let the city or the respective city know that they're planning on making that change. But they should have to be good, responsible dealers.
Operators.
That's all. But they should be good, responsible business owners during the process. So I would like to, when this comes back to us, because it sounds like this is going to come back to us, I would like to, sharpen the pencil on that.
Council member,
Thank you, Vice Mayor, for mentioning that.
if I may, this is Steve here, a couple of points briefly. As it relates to the selection process, we were evaluating the quality of the applicants. And someone puts forward a proposal, they say, this is our team, this is who we are, this is our experience. And then obviously, if that team changes, change in control, then you're not the people you said you were, and that factors into the selection process. The city attorney's office is exploring currently what happens after someone has a cannabis permit. There's a number of considerations, and they're exploring that. That's probably the extent to which we should go in to that subject in this forum.
Okay. I think that needs more thought, as the chair has said. We need to sharpen our pencil on that. I mean, also it relates to my other question around equity benefits. So if you choose an individual and they're not the operator and all they're doing is arbitraging it, I mean, that doesn't really, I think, accomplish the goal. David, you lost me a little bit about if we were to enhance the community and equity aspects, those requirements, something about the timing, and we have 2 people in 7 months.
Yeah. So we have a couple of issues. We have 2 existing operators who applied for the cannabis permit process, and they were selected to move forward. They were part of the top 6 group that were selected to move forward to obtain a cannabis permit. And they are under existing rules trying to go forward. If it's the council's desire to establish a new equity program, it, these two operators, or these two applicants, I should say, are existing, and they were scored and ranked and asked to move forward based on the existing rules that are in place today, just like the two that are in. And so the statement was, if it's and they have 7 months to find a spot. And so if they don't find a spot within 7 months, they're out of the process and they're done. And we have the three that we have. And if it's the council's desire to establish an equity program, and I would again reiterate that if that is the council's desire, in any event, we should look at changing the city's existing separation requirements, because establishing an equity program when there's no locations doesn't make a lot of sense. But the idea of the timing is that these two applicants are under the existing rules and need to finish that process. And that process has 7 more months, or until if they find a spot or 2 spots sooner, then that would also be okay. But it's really 7 months that they have. If they haven't found a spot and you haven't changed the rules by then I would suggest that, and you wanted to start a program, that would be the appropriate time.
Okay, so just to recap, that we would allow the current selected applicants to continue to play under the current rules, and that if we were to enhance the equity and community benefit piece, that would be part of maybe opening the aperture, because if these guys can't find places, it doesn't really matter, and then you would go out and look for new applicants.
I think question one is for the existing applicants, the two that are there. Do you want to just let the 7 months run and not change rules, and they probably won't find a spot? Or with those two, do you want to change the rules? Excuse me. Or do you want to change the distance separation requirements, allow them to find spots? That's question one. And then question two would be, if this social equity program seems to make sense, we should start looking at that and come back to you and provide more details. But that equity program couldn't start until we either found spots for these folks or the time ran. And I don't know, Teresa, if I'm missing something there in the explanation.
No,
But let me just clarify. Couldn't we maybe, once again, I'm not suggesting this is a path, but I just want to hypothesize here. Could we say that we would relax the rules if they met a higher standard of community benefit and equity impact? I mean, like, or do we have to let the current requirements play out because they were selected under that, and then revisit this, you know, when we start the clock, if we were to start the clock all over again on, 7 months and 1 day?
So I'll jump in here for a quick second. It would be best if you let the current current applicants who have ranked in the top 5 move forward under the scheme under which they were selected. In other words, don't up the requirements on them in the middle of the process. So
If
that
we were going to, I guess part of this, Teresa, is if there's no space and we were making an accommodation, I would argue that creating space for folks who don't have room, wouldn't there be a nexus for us to think about relaxing those rules and then asking more of them because we made a concession?
that would not be my recommendation, mainly because the two are separate issues. One is the zoning issues, and then the other is the selection of the applicant.
Okay.
However, and then the second part, I think, is this whole question of, do you start your social equity program now before these other two have spots under any relaxed standard? You could technically start your social equity program, although frankly, on a practical matter, it's not going to be up and running before these folks are situated. And again, from a due process standpoint, it's probably better to let these two settle out and then start the new social equity program.
But the social equity program, wouldn't that be a requirement of the operators? So
It
if
would
we
be.
accommodate these operators under existing plans, which some would argue don't have enough social equity, then kind of the getting more social equity benefits for the community is kind of a moot point because we've kind of filled up the playing field.
And
Well,
I just
so,
might,
and if I could just quickly finish, the social equity program, as I understand, well, and as you have just begun to discuss, would need to be a code amendments to Title V, because the code as currently structured just doesn't contemplate the social equity program. And frankly, you would want to codify it so that you have codified standards to which to hold these new applicants, um, um, and then be able to uh, withdraw their permits if they don't continue to meet those new standards.
Eh, eh,
So it would be almost like you had two groups of applicants, the ones that have already gone through the process, and then the ones that would go through a new process, a new codified process.
And if I might just jump, Vice Mayor, two issues. One is in most of the cities that have the social equity permitting program, it's usually uh, a 1-for-1 or some percentage thereof, meaning there are a certain number of overall permits, and then there's a certain number of these social equity permits, and those social equity permits are reserved for those individuals that qualify uniquely. I think that I didn't want to confuse the issue of community benefits with the social equity program. In other words, the existing operators, the two that are there and the third that has a permit, there is a community benefit component, such as each one of them is giving a certain amount of money um, to different nonprofits as part of that was part of their community benefit plan. So that exists within the existing construct. It was part of the application, the community benefit program. Um, the the social equity program is more about giving a permit to an individual who fits within whatever criteria that the council feels is the right criteria. Um, and so a lot of times we do see it's a 1-for-1. In other words, if a city has 10 permits to give, 5 are for social equity, and then 5 are, I'll just say, regular permits. And the permit applicants, it's based on different criteria, right? The ones that we're dealing with now are basically almost exclusively based on what is your experience to operate. Show us that you're a good operator, and that's how these 5 or 6 were selected today. And what we're talking about is maybe setting up a different criteria, not about if you're a good operator, but do you fit these standards? You live in the community, you have a certain income level, you are maybe incarcerated for a drug-related offense, or the council may say, we don't like that idea. We just want a program that has greater community benefits.
Okay. Okay, so that's kind of a set aside. I'm sorry, I didn't capture that distinction. That's very, very helpful. And can you give us, I once again can't remember, there's been so many lawsuits and who's doing what, but what's the status in the MedMen site? Because that is a code compliant location, am I right?
So I'll start.
One on-
I'll start with. So okay, and maybe Mr. Reyes should answer.
Well, the site is code compliant, and with respect to the status of the site, we don't know. We don't know if it's still controlled under some real estate deal by MedMen some way, or if it's on the market.
But if one of these operators were to get control of that site, then that would be another, and that's a legal location, and because they were already authorized, right? They met the requirements. So that could become a location, or if that location, let's say, became something else and they released it, there could be other adjacent, there's kind of a part of an area there that would accommodate an operator, right? In fact, either that could be potentially assumed by someone who's been approved, or if they release the site, that would then allow another location in that area because of the separation from to find an alternative site. Is that?
We believe there's at least one code compliant location in District 6.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
A quick question on the MedMen piece. Did MedMen need to go out actually through the planning commission before most of these locations go through the planning commission first?
MedMen was disqualified by the city manager from the process and was not allowed to move forward.
But okay, so the site, we don't know.
No, but the site is, yeah, the site meets the regulations from the zoning code for distance separation, but the findings for the conditional use permit were never made.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Rivas, did you have your hand? I'm sorry, was it Councilmember Madison? Sorry about that. Councilmember Madison, go ahead.
A couple of questions. I mean, are we talking about the same kind of social benefit programs that have been such a disaster in the city of LA?
The concept of social equity can be written different ways. The issues with Los Angeles, I think, are widely publicized. In concept, though, it's the similar type of concept. The regulations, though, and who gets it and how they get it and how they operate would be different and unique to Pasadena.
And would that be a distinction without a difference, or do we think that would?
No, yeah, the issues that I understand related to the social equity program in Los Angeles could be addressed by the city of Pasadena's regulations, and I don't think that we've seen it'd be much of a benefit to those folks, right? There was no ability for them to actually open. They didn't have the financial capital behind them. In other cases, businesses came behind them and cannibalized the permit, and they were only on paper. There are a lot of issues that I think we've seen from a positive perspective work in the city of Oakland. They haven't had the same problem, so I do think it's how it's tailored and how it's written. And again, these programs. I think the other benefit that we would have, Councilmember Madison, is that these first programs were the first ones ever done. City of Los Angeles, they were the first ones out of the gate. So we would have the benefit of understanding the trial and errors that they've gone through. And so that's, I think, the response there.
Okay, so
LA also, I'm sorry, I just wanted to let you know, LA also required ownership of property from those that were part of the equity piece of it. You had to actually own the building, so that was part of the reason why it was such a disaster in LA.
So right now we have a regulation that says no more than one per council district, correct?
Yes.
And no more than 6 total and no more than 1 per council district, if I recall.
Yes. Up to
So
6, no more than 1 per district.
So then what would this social equity program, what would the changes be in a very macro sense to that scheme?
So if you were to figure out a way, council member, to allow these other 2 to move forward, I'll just say conceivably you would have 5. And under a social equity program, it might be a 1-for-1 where you have 5 regular permits, I'll call them, and then 5 social equity. Or it could be whatever the council wants. It could be that you stop with the 3 that you have and you issue 3 more, or it could be that you fix the zoning regulations to allow the 2 to move forward, so you have 5 regular, and you decide some other arbitrary number for a social equity program, such or 3. What we've seen most often is the sort of the 1-for-1, but those are much larger cities that I identified for the social equity permits, and we've got a very limited number, so we would have to change the code if that's what council wanted to do, to increase the number from 6 to some other number.
Forgive me. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna follow on, but that feels like a foundational aspect of the ballot initiative was setting the number 6. So, from that strategy, do we feel like that's even I guess that feels like something that we'd have to convince ourselves that we were authorized to do that. I think we're authorized to reallocate, but I don't know, Steve, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm thinking somehow we're going to have 12 or 10. I don't know that our residents I know some of my residents would be deeply concerned about that.
If Vice Mayor, if I could really quickly, just to kind of center things, although I don't want to interrupt Mr. Madison's flow, there's this first issue of we have 3 permits issued, and are we interested in making some modifications to allow up to 5 of the initial applicants to operate? And then I think there's this other issue of, do we want to further our program, which essentially means having more operators? And if so, do we want to redo it with an eye to social equity? I think that's kind of how this all.
That's helpful, because my next question was actually, from a policy perspective, what are the goals and objectives we're trying to accomplish at this point? In other words, we had went through a ballot initiative, as was mentioned. We adopted a regulatory framework. It's what I'm hearing, three licenses?
Yes, cannabis permits for retail have been issued. 2 of the businesses are up and running. And as we've seen, because of the restrictions on 1 per council district, numbers 4 and 5 can't open, even though they found spaces that are otherwise code compliant.
And the 6th one is the MedMen
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if we could put that map back up, but it seems to me that rather than sort of do contortions here and have a very tortuous sort of record, just waiting for the map.
It's coming up.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's just, and I think I've said this before, that honestly, I appreciate the wisdom of the 1 per council district. But I also wonder, how many residents or other stakeholders drive around Pasadena, with their GPS voice telling them when they're leaving Council District 7 and entering Council District 4. I mean, I just think it's a purely artificial political boundary. And, one looks at this map, clearly these businesses, for whatever reason, are tending to locate along Colorado Boulevard or a block or so to either side. We have redistricting underway. These boundaries may change anyway. These applicants have, it's sort of like some reality TV show or something, The Great Race. They've survived. They've gotten to this point. And in order to do that, they had to have, organization, capital, a track record. They have to have a certain level of probity in terms of their business and their application. I think the simplest solution is to modify the 1 per district and go forward. I mean, for example, I think the Constance Hotel on the northwest corner of Lake in Colorado are close geographically, I suppose, but kind of completely different locations. And similarly, the Atrium location and the northwest corner of Lake in Colorado may be in the same council district. I guess that's part of the problem, is that those orange dots are both in the same council district. Is that an issue?
Council district, as well as distance to, in the case of Atrium, it's too close to Harvest under the 600-foot rule, and then Sweet Flower too close to Essence. So it's both of those issues. And staff had previously recommended a 450-foot separation versus the 600 feet, and then more than up to 3 per council district.
And would the 450 foot solve these 2 problems?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that's the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and I think that's true in this case, policy-wise also. So that would be what I would support.
If I might just comment, I mean, Steve, I went out and visited as you know, Essence is in District 7, and I agree with your point, by the way, these council districts are very arbitrary, and sometimes I'm not exactly sure if I'm in your district or my district. There's certain areas where, very tortured. So I feel like that is a kind of an abstract notion. But the actual
if they're praising the council, you're in my district. If they're criticizing it, you're in your.
That's probably a good rule of thumb. But if you go look at the Essence and Sweet Flower, you actually literally can stick your head out the door and see the other location. They're kind of not even 1 block length apart. So you do end up, in my view, that feels like it's too close, because you're kind of looking. It's like looking at one liquor store and looking at another one. I do feel there's maybe not a magic number, but that locations feel a little too close. When I look at the the Harvest and Atrium, they're around the block. I mean, it's kind of, you have to walk around the block. It's not kind of in the same neighborhood. So I think those are different circumstances, but I agree with you. The council district, I think, seems like, yeah, it's kind of a random, and I understand that 3 of these would be in council district 3, but that just happens. I think that's just a fragment or an arbitrary circumstance. But anyway, I did want to let you know that, disclose that I had actually gone out and visited these 2 sites. I visited one in, by the way, went inside. I had to give them my ID, but I wasn't buying anything. And was impressed by the operation, honestly, but I did see how close they were. And I took some photographs because I was concerned about the sense of, having multiple within kind of eye shot.
I agree to an extent with that concern about having these locations. And I do definitely agree that these are political boundaries and they're going to change and shift. So the whole idea of having one per council district makes literally no sense. And we've got that stuck in our mind that it's got to be one, but the zoning doesn't allow that. So, but when I look at the liquor license, I mean, I could walk outside and there's a club and there's a restaurant and there's a bar, and I'm looking right across the street from the difference between these locations and bars, and just my humble experience, you could go into a bar and I could order 10 shots and drink them right there on the spot, right? In these places, you couldn't smoke on premises. I mean, we would shut it down. So we have a lot more leeway with these locations as a city, and a lot more control of these type of businesses as a city than any other business in our city. So having them across the street from one another, to me, is not it just kind of happens to be where it's at. I mean, the zoning, it's not next to a single family household residential neighborhood. The zoning kind of, it allows that. I mean, that's where, a lot of our commercial activity is happening. It's kind of a hot spot. It's, just like Colorado Boulevard, there's tons of bars right next to each other. Everybody could drink. I know more people getting pulled over with, just because I've gotten a lot of these emails. One reason I'm only mentioning this, because they're like, oh my gosh, people are going to be, just high out of you can't smoke on the street. So, and in these facilities are worth millions upon millions of dollars. And none of these business owners are going to allow their customers to do that and actually get shut down. So I definitely agree with both of your statements, but having them across the street from one another is, neither here nor there for just for me, but I think, when we look at it again, we take this back and look at the zoning again, there's really no other way to produce what we said we were going to produce without laxing on these restrictions. But as we're laxing on these restrictions, I think it's important, just like I advocate for Pasadena businesses all the time, that we put Pasadena people first. None of these organizations, not one of these corporations is, well, maybe Vallarta. I mean, Verta, is it Verta? Maybe Verta, maybe. None of these corporations are Pasadena-based people. We didn't give a Pasadena-based opportunity, and our opportunity said that if you are a good performer, like if you have a track record of doing this, well, who better to have a track record of doing this than someone who got arrested for doing this? So as far as I don't know how you could have a track record for doing something that was illegal for a long time. And I have to give an opportunity to Pasadena, just back to the equity piece of it, not just social equity for Pasadena residents, Pasadena business owners, Pasadena residents, people who grew up here. I think we have to give them a real fair shot at actually being an owner and not just someone who is working in one of these locations.
Maybe just to respond, I'm sorry, Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just briefly, I think I hear all the points that are made. I think the other thought I had about the proximity of the Colorado and Lake sort of location was, my understanding was, in terms of signage and sort of curbside presence, was that we were pretty restrictive in terms of that. So, I mean, you might know, Andy, if you stuck your head out the door, that there was another one right down the block, but I don't know that for just passersby that would necessarily be the case. I think the strongest argument from, against overconcentration probably is a competitive one that, if these businesses are investing in advertisement and brand ID and all that, there is a risk that you'd set out to go to store A, but you'd end up at store B just because that's where you found a parking place and there it is type thing. But I have to think that would even out over time, and that I'm not sure that should be our concern really. So, but I do appreciate your comments.
I think Tyrone sometimes ends up in the wrong bar that he was not planning to because the parking spot was in front of one versus the other.
Councilmember Rivas.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to say, further in line with this conversation about distance, it's always struck me as a little strange that there's so much commercial real estate available right now, but the locations on the map are so restricted for cannabis retailers, and of course nowhere in districts 1, 2, or 5 right now, or the current versions of those districts. So I'm open to adjusting, like it sounds like everyone else is, to adjusting the distance requirements, but I think it may make sense to do it in a way that would allow those retailers to be further spread out, addressing some of the concerns that were raised already, and would be, I think, in line with the spirit of that one council or one retailer per district rule. Whether or not we keep that rule exactly, but I think we should definitely look at adjusting the distance requirements to open up some more space on the map. And it's kind of hard to see what, at least for me, when I've been reviewing this for the last couple of days, it's hard to envision on the map what adjustments would open what space where. And so I guess we'd have to work with staff, but perhaps it's a matter of looking to align more closely with the state requirements. I'm not sure.
Councilmember Rivas, if I may, just briefly, I could see how it would be tempting to say, let's make some adjustments so applicant number 4 and number 5 could operate, but maybe move, a block down. My understanding, I don't know if it applies to both of them, but my understanding is that all of the applicants, which includes 4 and 5, have entered into third-party private arrangements for lease property. There's substantial financial arrangements there. So I just want to point that out because it may not be such that they can just pick up and find the vacant storefront 2 blocks down. Now, if that's what it takes for them to operate, then they have to make a business decision. But I just wanted to point out that it's not that clean.
Right. Okay, got it. That's helpful. But at the same time, they also made those arrangements knowing that there were more than one. I mean, there were 3 of them in one district. They knew about that rule.
Right. They had no CUP, they had no cannabis permit, so they took a business risk.
Pasadena, a top six applicant. We urge the EdTech to support changes to the ordinance that would reduce the separation between dispensaries from 1,000 to 450 feet, and to sensibly amend the one per district rule to allow more dispensaries to be situated. In addition, we urge the EdTech to support the creation of a robust social equity program. As you know, there are two kinds of zoning restrictions in Pasadena. The first kind protects actual sensitive uses, churches, schools, parks, and neighborhoods. The second kind prohibits dispensaries from opening within 1,000 feet of each other or in the same district. In effect, the second kind of restriction protects other operators, stifles competition, and the goals of Measure CC. These restrictions alone have resulted in only 3 dispensaries being able to open. Amending just these restrictions alone would open up locations for all successful applicants and would not affect actual sensitive uses. I do want to make an additional point here. In districts 1, 2, and 5, there are no compliant locations. Opening up those districts, as Councilmember Rivas mentioned, would require taking the distance separations for churches, schools, parks, and neighborhoods down to about 150 feet from 600. I think that would be very, very tight. The other argument that has been raised is that one per district somehow spreads dispensaries around, and we believe that's wrong. MedMen's proposed location in District 6 was far closer to Harvest location in District 3 than our location is. Even though we are both in the same district, we're actually over a mile from Harvest. It is my understanding also, as it came up, that MedMen's location is not available. There's a corporate guarantee on that location. We have asked, and that is not available. We've also taken a very extensive, diligent search of all locations in Pasadena, and frankly, there are very few available locations, ours and the other ones listed. There are no other available locations at all in Pasadena after an extensive 2-year search. However, understandably, the two current operators like these competition restrictions. They serve them well, and they would rather that you look elsewhere for a fix. These restrictions frustrate the purpose and the will of the voters, and having only 2 operators in the city suits only those 2 operators. Since being selected as a top 6 applicant,
1 minute left, sir.
We have been paying rent at our location in CD3, and we remain in good standing. We filed a complete 2P application and had no change of control or ownership. We remain committed to opening our store as soon as possible. We are strong proponents of inclusivity, diversity, and social equity. No other operator has done more to advance this cause than Sweet Flower. All our stores and our corporate office actively promote diversity, community engagement, and social equity. We're 80% diverse across our company. We proudly support Black and brown-owned brands at 10 times the state average. We have contributed over $175,000 in community benefits in Los Angeles County alone. Unlike other operators, we're already working in Pasadena with the Pasadena Community Coalition and with the Pasadena African American Cannabis brand to launch that brand at all of our stores. And we trust that will very soon include our store in Pasadena. In addition to the zoning changes required to fulfill the will of the voters expressed in Measure CC, we urge EdTech to support the creation of a thoughtful and robust social equity program benefiting Pasadena residents. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Next speaker, Patel Kasparian. We'll bring you now. Can you please press, oh, there you are.
Hi.
Good, you can start now. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Patil, Pasadena resident and also the property owner of Sweet Flowers location. I promised myself that I would not get emotional, but Councilmember Madison's comments were right on. Years of emotional, physical, mental, and financial exhaustion. Honestly, we have survived, but it's been very, very tough. So thank you, Councilmember Madison. And in acknowledging this, I also want to thank the city staff and city council for 3 years of research, development, and execution of a very large and difficult undertaking. It's been a rough process for all of us. Please consider the following. Timing is critical. By addressing this ordinance change now, we bring significant and immediate benefits to the city and residents. New jobs, community benefits, and much needed tax revenue. Next, as a voter, I agree with the staff report. Voters do reasonably expect there to be 6 cannabis retailers. Up to 6 does not mean 2 operational retailers with no competition. Up to 6 means our best effort to place 6 retailers in the city. Verbatim from the staff report, If market demand exceeds that which can be satisfied by the operation of legally permitted operators, an incentive will exist for illegal operators to re-enter the marketplace. As the city has experienced, closing down such operators can be costly and time-consuming. If we end up with 3 or even 4 dispensaries, Pasadena would rank as the highest or second highest ratio of population to licensed retailers. The city has completed multiple land use studies and in doing so has recommended a fair solution that continues to protect sensitive uses. We cannot allow general comments and assumptions about churches, specifically that churches are occupied mostly, if not only on Sundays, and have declining populations. It's important to understand that a church campus of any
Ma'am, you have 1 minute left. Thank you.
thank you, is not used exclusively for Sunday prayer. Rather, it is home to many youth activities, family and group gatherings, sports activities, and other extracurricular activities. I humbly urge you to support the staff recommendation to finalize the remaining retail applications and advance to the placement of labs and cultivators. Additionally, with the recommendation of the EdTech Committee, the city should create and launch a social equity program and place multiple applicants in retail, cultivation, and lab operations with the support of existing cannabis operators. In closing, I want to highlight a letter of support submitted by Mr. Martin Gordon, chairman of the Pasadena Community Coalition. He ends his letter as follows. If amending the ordinance will finally bring a retailer with a social equity conscious and commitment, how can we say no? Amend the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes public comment on the matter.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from committee members? I did, Vice Mayor?
I had more of a comment than a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think, I don't want to speak for all my colleagues, but my sense is that the idea of, one per district is kind of a artifact that's arbitrary. So maybe as a standalone item, I'd like to throw that out as, does anyone want to argue for the 1 per district? So at least we feel like that's something that we could say that, once again, with redistricting and, the way the lines work, and literally you could have 2 districts, they abut, so you could have 1 per district and they could be pretty close by. So I think that, I understand the intent of that, but I just don't think that has a practical benefit. That's an easy one for me. I think the harder ones are the separation, and I hear Councilmember Madison's point. Part of this is also, especially in District 7, and those 2 locations are right at the juncture of District 6 and 7. The idea of cannabis operations are still very new and quite daunting for a number of our residents, and we have 2 operators that have been operating for a few months. I'm glad they're going well, but the idea of having one kitty corner to another, I think is going to be hard for some people to swallow. So I think I have to, on behalf of the residents of District 7, I'm uncomfortable with the 450. It feels like we're just, if we're going to set up a number, that's an arbitrary number. Like we're kind of force fitting it. No one has a 450-foot separation. It's either 500, 750. So I am sympathetic to the applicant who has a location, but I'm wondering if we looked at something between 500 and 1,000, whether that would open up spaces, plus releasing the 1 per district. Maybe that would allow more opportunities. So I guess I would ask the staff to investigate if they did a study in the zoning maps and said, if we removed the 1 per district, what would it do if we brought that number to either 750 or 500 feet, rather than just force fitting an arbitrary number that's 450. I mean, it's very kind of site specific. So that would be my recommendation on maybe kind of a next item on that number, on that item. And I think the last one on social equity, if we accommodate 6, then I don't think we're going to have opportunity for a social equity operator. So either we need to resign ourselves to having a more active community benefit program, or if we only, we got to figure that we have to reconcile those, because if we end up filling up all the slots with people who are currently on deck, I feel uncomfortable, putting a seventh operator, and I feel like that would be contrary to the will of the voters, because I think that was, a very specific commitment. I think we have the latitude to make these types of adjustments. So I'm kind of not sure about the social equity piece. I think that's harder to accommodate. But those would be, at least to get the conversation going here. And I know Steve has to leave in 25 minutes. I figured I'd throw out a straw man to work with.
Well, thank you for that. I did just want to mention that, what is the, I had a quick question for David. Reyes, what is the distance separation between liquor licenses or bars and liquor stores? They're separate.
There is none except for within the, we have an alcohol overlay zone within Old Pasadena. There's an 81 and an 82, and it's either 700 feet or 1,000 feet. And that's where there's an overconcentration. But in general, and those are for very specific types of liquor licenses, not just a restaurant liquor license. Those are for the bars and clubs. In general, there are no distance separation requirements for liquor licenses.
Okay. Thank you. I just was mentioning it once again because these facilities are not, I know that there is a lot of anxiety around having a business like this in the city, but these locations are now fully legal. These are voted on by the voters, and they're nowhere near what we would see as a bar or even a restaurant bar, because there's no consumption of this on premise. By the way, you said that there were 2 calls for service for the locations, or is that both locations or just one location?
No, at the time of the report, it was just for the Varda location, and it was the Varda operator. It was the Varda operator calling the police.
Okay, and then right across the street from City Hall, right? I mean, we have California Pizza Kitchen. You have what's the name of the steakhouse? Like Alexander's Steakhouse, and they all have full liquor licenses as well. And I'm only mentioning liquor because liquor is a problem, right? And we don't, I mean, at least right now, don't hear about DUIs, people getting pulled over for consumption of cannabis. Also, to the social equity piece, as Councilmember Madison mentioned about, people that were bad actors prior to cannabis being legalized. I think at some point that, if you serve your time, you've done what you need to do, that we as a people, we have to forgive and let these people move on so that they could build a life for their families. I have a couple actually really kind of cool stories. I have a best friend and my next door neighbor. They came here to America at young ages. They were not considered, they didn't have documentation, I would say. And some people would call them, they weren't legally a citizen in the United States. They are now naturalized citizens, and they're both business owners. They're very successful people. And our mayor happens to be a person who came here at a young age, and his parents, they worked their way up. And I don't think that we should, penalize people for decisions. Rather that people do things to do what they got to do to better their lives. And I think personally, giving someone a job here and there is not helpful. But if we're actually giving them opportunity to be an owner, that's changing a life. And so that's the reason why I've always been pushing the pro Pasadena person or pro social equity, because we need to change lives. We don't need to give people handouts anymore. We need to teach them how to fish. So that was my comment about the social equity piece. Go ahead, Councilman Madison.
Thank you, and I appreciate your comments, and you stay on message when it comes to supporting Pasadena residents, and I really admire that, and I agree to a point. One question though, just kind of a practical question: if one of the applicants has fallen out, as I think we've heard, and you indicated, Mr. Chair, that number 7 was sort of a local applicant or something. Will that applicant move into a position to be able, if we lift the council constraint about council districts? Does anybody know? Will that?
Yeah, Councilmember Madison, it was not our plan to elevate anybody beyond the initial 6 because up to this point, we haven't been able to land the first 6. And even though one of the 6 fell out, we only have 3 that have been able to land. So we didn't want to compound our situation by adding yet another one that can't find a location. So it's a bit of a threshold question. Are we going to modify our requirements such that 4 and 5 can land? I suppose theoretically we could modify it such that there is even more opportunity and we might be able to reach further down the list perhaps. I haven't consulted with the city attorney, but in also hearing the discussion today, one of the questions is if we were opening more spots beyond the initial intake, would we want to restructure and introduce a social equity type component?
Well, I'm nervous about that kind of wholesale retooling, but I was wondering, just as a practical matter, whether the mandate from the voters was 6 or no more than 6. I don't see a reason why, if one of the top 6, if you will, fell out, that we wouldn't then look to the next applicant in line, especially if, as the chair says, they're a local applicant.
But then we would have 3 that can't find a spot, and now at present we have 2. So we would just be compounding our circumstance.
Well, we're not doing this in isolation. We're also, I think there's consensus to remove the council district constraint. And I don't know how much of an impact that would. I would also support, and to the vice mayor's comments, it sounds like the staff was on 450 before any of these problems cropped up. So I don't think that's quite as arbitrary as one might otherwise think in terms of 450. I would actually support, doing both of that. They say hell is a place with endless due process, but no justice. It'd be really good to do something here in a council meeting where we can move forward, and I think if we did those kind of 3 steps, we did the lift the council district constraint, change the geographic limitation to 450 feet, and then direct staff, if you will, to continue to try to cite 6 applicants. If that number 7 is essentially a de facto social equity local applicant, that might be the best outcome all around.
Could I ask as a follow-up, Chair? I don't know. I'm not familiar with applicant 7, so I'm not. I mean, it may be a brilliant idea. I just haven't done the homework. So I would like that maybe to come back as I feel like we've sent this to committee to workshop this a little bit, Steve. So we have if we thought this was going to be one meeting, we should have extended it by a month, not 7 months. So this is a controversial issue, and I don't want to torture ourselves either, by the way. But I do think you're being responsive to Councilmember Madison's question of who would come up next, I think is important. It's obviously a moot point if we don't open the aperture because there's no space for it. But I'd like to see the study map come back, removing the council district requirements, and then we know I'd like to see the 450 because we have a heat map. I don't think we've seen that heat map of what that would look like because we ran this number of these before. And I'd like to see the 500, and I'd like to see the 700, which would tie to the precedent of what we have for certain liquor licenses. Those at least are linked to some precedent in terms of zoning codes. So that would be would propose to the chair is maybe a session 2, so we can prepare. If we had that, I think we would be prepared to at least more comfortable in making a recommendation on how to proceed.
Councilman Rivas?
I just had a quick question for the vice mayor. In your proposed, I guess, different numbers you wanted staff to look at, is that just for the distance requirement between two businesses? Because wouldn't that actually not open up that much? Because we know which ones are existing right now, so it would just be around those existing areas.
Well, if they went down to 500, that would, and part of this, there's so many layers of, impact and, kind of sensitive uses. It's actually, the answer is not necessarily as obvious as you think it is. Having looked at this before, and I assume that, we have those models, and if we could run that, and maybe it doesn't, and maybe it doesn't solve the problem, but I do think when our peers ask us, whatever our recommendation is, how we got there, I think it's an incumbent upon us to at least have done a little homework and put a little bit more analysis into this. And at minimum, I know I want to be able to be responsive to my constituents to say that we didn't, just expedite this issue through, because it did get a lot of attention when we first came up with the ordinances.
Right. I think I'm interested in the same thing, trying to open up the map. But I just think it might take a different, tweaking one of the other distance requirements. I'm not sure which one would make the most sense, but I just worried we'd have to play with the other requirements, not just the distance between two.
Maybe I'd ask the staff, maybe if that, is an exercise of futility running those two scenarios, that they come up with other alternatives, right? To say we workshop this and we looked at 3 different ways, and 450 is not just an arbitrary number, but it's, the best number. It just happens to be what works for, I can't remember which, is it Sweet Flower, right? What is the separation? I think it was in a prior staff report between Harvest and Atrium.
Between Harvest and Atrium, 558 feet.
Okay. So even if we came with 500, that one would be a yes. Anyway, that would be my recommendation. I feel like we're not going to get a lot further today, is my view, unless we.
I agree.
I think we have some good ideas. I definitely think the idea of looking at number 7, I'd love to hear more about them. I am interested in having more exposition around the community benefit requirement, because I feel like that, maybe I've forgotten what that is. Maybe, are we able to enhance that in existing operators, or is that kind of a contractual requirement that is established when we grant them a permit?
Vice Mayor, they were evaluated based on what they included in their proposal as far as community benefits. So that was the floor, if you will. They certainly can enhance their offering. For example, and although they don't have a cannabis permit, the Pasadena Community Coalition signed an MOU with Sweet Flower that included some things that were above and beyond what was in their initial proposal that was, evaluated and part of their overall score. So our process set a minimum, a threshold that they have to adhere to. They can always do better. And in our discussions with interested community members, we've encouraged them to talk to existing operators about enhancing their programs.
Well, maybe as that next study session, Chair, we could get an update on where people are, because I think, Councilor Madison seems reticent about kind of set aside, but, obviously it's not the same thing, but it's kind of headed in the same direction, is making sure if we're not having a social equity license, that the community benefits that are being generated by those who are licensed are sufficiently robust.
That's fine. So has staff had an opportunity to gather these thoughts, because I think that the distancing is a great conversation. Also, pinning the paper of how does one sell right after they receive a license?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair,
That was our.
yeah, so what I've heard we appreciate the discussion today. This is exactly what we were hoping to engage in. Staff would go back and do a few things. We will run some different sort of sensitivity analysis on the maps. Of course, people have to remember that the maps are fairly high level, and when someone applies, we have to scrutinize, but it gives you a general sense of availability. So we can go and we'll work with some different separations there. We'll also do a write-up on what the community benefits were included in the successful applicants' packages. We'll also take a look at what it would mean if we were to reach further down our list, whether we're able to do that or whether it's expired. Your last question about change of ownership, as I mentioned earlier, is something that's being reviewed by the city attorney's office. That should follow that track and be the subject of communication, if necessary, from the city attorney to the council.
Okay,
One more question.
go ahead.
So, Harvest and MedMen, Harvest has been permitted, but hasn't, I mean, at some point, is there an expiration, like, we give them an entitlement, and if they don't do something, then it reverts back, and also MedMen, is there some sort of statutes of limitation on selection or entitlements or anything like that would allow some movement?
The adopted code required them to obtain a cannabis permit within 12 months. And so they obtained the cannabis permit. They didn't open. So technically, I would imagine it would be at the annual renewal. If there is no business there, I don't want to say what would happen exactly, but that would be opportunity to review that. MedMen never received the cannabis permit and were removed from the process.
So I know I'm believing there's so much litigation. I imagine as part of that, at what point can we re-award? I guess it comes into the idea of bringing up number 7, right? Is we have to kind of get rid of one that's no longer eligible.
Yep.
So maybe knowing that there's probably some legal issues, I'm not sure what you can share.
See, I had a point on number 7, bringing that up as well. I think, I don't know, like you said, Vice Mayor, bringing it up might have some legal constraints to doing that, because someone else will say, well, why wasn't I number 7? But I was thinking, because we do have one location, because one application was completely denied by the city manager, which was, is that MedMen that was denied?
Yeah.
Okay, so MedMen was completely denied. My suggestion would be to let people apply Pasadena based, and let's hear what a social equity be on one store. So that we could at least get one of these locations as a Pasadena based business.
Well,
Council member, I think that would require a change to our ordinance if we were to try to set up a select process even for one license, because it would deviate from what is adopted currently.
Chair, can I suggest maybe there's this whole discussion of, do we bump up number 7 to be number 6, or alternatively, do we stop with 5 and kind of reselect using a different criteria? Maybe that comes back as, once again, the work item there is, because it's kind of solving it. I don't think we want to bring in more than 6. I really feel strongly that would be pushing the envelope. So the question is, do you bump someone up, or do you reselect with different criteria? And maybe that's the action item for the staff on our next meeting on that specific.
That sounds good to me. That's what I was trying to get at was, let's still see what the social equity piece of it would look like. That would be Pasadena centric, and maybe we don't bump somebody up. Maybe we do decide, oh, you know what? There's one location, maybe even 2, depending on and one of the other applicants, if they, their year renewal, if they've done anything by that time. So we definitely should, in my mind, should at least tease it out and see, where we land. I think we have a great opportunity. There's some really good models out there, especially with the models that they showed from Oakland and San Francisco, that we can tailor something for Pasadena. So, Steve, are you good with direction?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And I think we got everybody out of here in an hour and a half.
Aaron, can I, on the social equity piece, not to belabor it, but I'm wondering, is there a model where rather than it's an individual, and whether you could critique our selection for the community police oversight, but kind of is an organization or a co-op that represents kind of as a community benefit aspect, or is, run by, I'm making this up, but some benefit that, that represents not just one person, but a group of people that are on as you said, corrected their lives and on kind of a path, and as an organization that helps that happen. And maybe that would be someone we would consider rather than a single operator. I don't know, that may be a crazy idea, but that would allow us.
I actually think that's a solid idea. I've kind of teased that out in my head too, as an organization that is doing this work versus getting that, that check that these other organizations are giving them. Why not give them the opportunity to create jobs and get people back on their feet? That should,
the homeboy industries, but instead of making brownies, they're making type of brownie, and
they're making brownies. They're still making brownies. Well, actually, I think you'll never laugh for that, but yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm fine with. I think that sounds like a reasonable next step to me.
Perfect. Councilman Madison, did you have?
No, good discussion, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
I think this was productive, so thank you.
Thank
Wish
you.
us a happy birthday.
Yeah, wishes on happy birthday for me.
Yeah. So they grow old quickly, I'll tell you. So.
And City Manager, what is the expected time frame of having this back to us?
Council member, I'll need to get with the team to see how quickly some of these elements I think we could turn around relatively quick, but some we'll have to work on. We know that this is a current topic, so we'll work to turn it around just as quick as we can.
Okay.
I mean, my goal would be, a couple of weeks.
Oh, sounds good. Councilman Rivas, did you have anything before we close?
No, thank you.
Perfect. Vice Mayor, you good?
Good. Thank you all.
All right, everybody, have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Happy Memorial Day.
I got it.
Thanks.